Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout Loud, a weekly biotech podcast from Stat. I'm Meg Terrell.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, May 18th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
The Federal Trade Commission has filed a lawsuit seeking to block Amgen's $28 billion acquisition of Horizon Therapeutics. We'll speak with Jared Holz, biotech strategist from Mizuho Securities, about what the government's action means for the proposed merger and its implications for future biotech deal-making.
But first, we'll catch up on Sarepta Therapeutics and its gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, chat about a turnaround story in the making at the Belgian drug maker Galapagos, and bring you the latest on the effort to secure approval for a maternal RSV vaccine.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
Hey there, my name is Nicholas St. Fleur. I'm a science reporter here at Stat, and I'm thrilled to announce the second season of Color Code, Stat's podcast on racial health inequities. In our second season, we're taking things local to my hometown of Long Island.
Long Island's history is one of segregation. Long Island continues to be one of the most segregated parts of our country.
Where you live has a huge impact on your health. Long Island is a microcosm of racial health inequities that exist in suburbs across the country.
The racial residential segregation in a place like Nassau County, starting from infant mortality to premature death and everything in between. We see that many of these causes of death are consistently higher in communities of color.
We'll hear from researchers, patients, clinicians, and advocates on the health inequities Long Islanders face and how communities here are trying to close these gaps. From the front lines of a battle over a landfill to the efforts to address food insecurity and disparities in maternal mortality across the island. Racism in medicine is a national emergency. Together, let's raise the alarm.
So happening as we record is a meeting of FDA advisors on a new and up for approval vaccine for RSV from Pfizer. Meg, what makes this vaccine different from the one that it feels like we were just talking about a couple weeks ago?
The one we were talking about a couple weeks ago was from GSK, and it was for older adults, 60 plus, to prevent the terrible symptoms of RSV, which stands for respiratory syncytial virus. The one that's under discussion today at the FDA is Pfizer's vaccine that is given during pregnancy, late in the second trimester or in the third trimester, to try to protect babies in the first 6 months of life. And that's really important because we do find that, most people get RSV infections through the course of their lives, and the CDC says usually it's a mild cold. But for some groups, particularly the elderly, and also young babies, babies born prematurely, or kids with health conditions or weakened immune systems, it can be really severe and potentially life-threatening. And so the hope is that if you can provide this vaccine during pregnancy, that babies will get that, passive immunity passed on, and they'll have antibodies in the early months of their lives to protect them. And Pfizer showed in clinical trials that the vaccine was about 80% effective in the first 3 months of life in preventing severe RSV symptoms, and then about 70% effective as babies got a little older, between 3 and 6 months. And those antibodies really did wane over time, or the protection waned over time, so that, once they're beyond 6 months old, there isn't a whole lot of protection there happening from this vaccine that, pregnant parents got during pregnancy. And so, the advisors are going to be discussing all of this evidence today. There's also going to be a big discussion around the safety here. There was a potential signal, or at least an imbalance, seen in the trials in preterm births. for people who got the vaccine versus people who didn't. However, it wasn't statistically significant. And the percentage of preterm births in the trial was actually lower than you typically see just generally. But because there was that imbalance, and also because there was a similar signal that popped up for GSK's maternal RSV vaccine, where GSK actually ended up discontinuing that vaccine, that is something that the committee is going to be looking at really, really closely. But guys, we did a story for CNN this week about a family who had, twin babies, and they were born prematurely. And, when one of them finally got home, fairly shortly thereafter, he caught RSV. He has an older brother. Maybe that's how he got it. And, he got really sick really suddenly. And, he was hospitalized and intubated. Ultimately, he is fine, and his mom described both him and his twin brother as fat and juicy now. They are doing great. They're almost a year old, and I got to meet them down in Atlanta this week, and they're so cute. But it is so scary that this can happen, and there's just nothing out there, or very little out there that can protect babies. I think one really big question, though, is, we still don't have a vaccine for older babies or for kids. And I was talking with Daniel Weinberger, who is at the Yale School of Public Health, and he studies RSV. And as a side note, I should note, I also went to middle school with him. But I was asking him about the potential impact of this vaccine. And he said one thing that, will be a sort of question for the real world is, because these babies have protection from the maternal antibodies, if they get exposed in that period, do they, then mount their own immune response? And if they don't, what does that mean for when they are exposed in the next season and protection against severe disease then? So I thought that was a really interesting question. And I don't know if it'll be something that's discussed today because there isn't, a whole lot of information around it. But if there could be this kind of protection early in life, I think that would help a lot of parents who worry about this. We saw how big of an impact RSV had, in this previous season.
So obviously we don't know the outcome of the meeting that is happening as we record this. People listening to this may, in fact, by the time this comes out. But Meg, looking forward, what is the expected decision date for the FDA on this vaccine, and how might the kind of dynamics you're describing look once there are two approved, albeit different, vaccines for RSV?
The FDA is expected to decide on this vaccine by August. So we'll see which way the vote goes at the end of today and, which way the FDA decides. If this becomes available, we're heading into the fall with a vaccine that can be given during pregnancy. And so we'll start to see how that rollout looks, as well as a vaccine that can be given to people over 60, potentially for this fall, upcoming RSV season. And so you will, if these are both out there on the market and endorsed by the FDA, start to see the protection for the most vulnerable in the population, the oldest and the youngest among us. And I think public health experts are very hopeful that that will start to make a dent against one of these big three viruses we now have to contend with in the cold and flu season.
All right, shifting gears. Damien, you wrote a great story this week about the Belgian drug maker Galapagos, which you described as the worst investment in biotech, but also one that has a very intriguing new CEO and a potential turnaround. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, Galapagos is a company I think a lot of people are aware of, but maybe stopped paying attention to, for a ton of reasons. But I think, going back to 2019, Galapagos was a roughly $10 billion company. It had this sizable pipeline of promising medicines and had developed a reputation as being really good at discovering and inventing its own drugs, even by relatively lofty standards within biotech. And that led to a $5 billion agreement with Gilead Sciences, which was sort of the inaugural move by Daniel O'Day, CEO of Gilead Sciences, when he became CEO in 2019. And from that point forward, Galapagos went through this Book of Job series of misfortune and bad events, basically. So the crowning drug, a treatment called filgotinib, was rejected by the FDA. This was a drug that was, the cliche pipeline in a product. It had applications in all sorts of autoimmune diseases. It soon became clear it would never be approved in the most lucrative market for new drugs, which is the United States. That's bad. And then from there, Galapagos's late-stage medicines just kept failing, one after the other, until the stock price was cut by something like 80% over time, and where that worst investment thing comes from, which is maybe getting a little too cute, but Galapagos has had an enterprise value, which is to say, the market cap, the sum of the company's market value minus its cash and liquid assets of negative $2 billion. It hovers around, I think, negative 1.7 billion now, but it moves back and forth. And that number, we talked about it, it's just like so gobsmacking that was kind of my initial intrigue in wanting to learn more about what was going on there, because as Emily Field, an analyst from Barclays, told me, they're valued as though they're just lighting their cash on fire. Of course, they are not just lighting their cash on fire. So that is kind of the entryway into figuring out what it is they're doing. And basically, they have about $4.5 billion in cash. And they recruited Paul Stoffels, who spent many years at Johnson & Johnson in escalating positions of authority, but eventually kind of just steering their pharmaceutical research by and large. He is Belgian. And they convinced him, after he retired from J&J last year, to come in and be the CEO and chairman of the company and kind of, I don't want to say remake it in his image, but he seems to have carte blanche to figure out what the new Galapagos will be. And it's not something I think, or at least that I've seen in biotech before, of just such a blank slate. It's basically a company with no late stage pipeline because all those drugs failed, $4.5 billion, and a new CEO who is promising to kind of just do a completely different thing than what Galapagos was built on, which, like I said, was on discovering and spinning up its own medicines, whereas Stoffels' name or his reputation, I think, was cemented on finding promising new drugs outside of J&J, investing in them in the relatively early stages of their development such that they can be had for the cheap, and then shepherding them into becoming approved products that make lots and lots of money for Johnson & Johnson. The key examples are Imbruvica, a treatment for blood cancer, the subject of the book that Nathan Vardy wrote and we talked about on this podcast. J&J got in there for about $10 million, some relatively small, by pharmaceutical terms, amount of money. And then 4 years later, AbbVie bought the other 50% of the rights to that drug for $21 billion, which is one of the more dramatic, I think, examples from the Stoffels resume on the kind of deals that he's done. And so the flip side of it being, according to the market, the worst investment in biotech is that, according to some people, it's potentially the best investment in biotech of a generation, because if Paul succeeds and you bought in at this negative $2 billion valuation, if he is able to turn this into what it once was or something even greater with respect to valuation, then, investors stand to make a lot of money.
So what is the plan as Stoffels is coming into Galapagos here? What should we expect to see from him and the company going forward?
So he's been there for about a year, and the way he described what they've done since then, a lot of it is just recruiting new people into the company, but is kind of the two-pronged thing of they do want to reimagine, let's say, how Galapagos has done its own drug discovery to this point. The company was focused on the very high-risk, high-reward world of finding new drug targets and kind of owning those. It played out the way it played out. So I think the future Galapagos will be trying to develop the best potential medicine for perhaps a target that is already well understood. At the same time is the $4.5 billion in cash, which Galapagos has said many times they plan to spend on in-licensing new things without being terribly specific about what those things will be. They have done 2 deals to date, relatively small, to acquire a company that is focused on like therapeutic antibodies, which is something Galapagos had not done previously, and then a company that has a proprietary approach to CAR T that involves bedside manufacturing. So not to get too into the weeds, but CAR T cancer therapy, the process of taking a patient's cells, genetically engineering them, and putting them back in can take about a month. That varies, and companies are trying to make it faster. Galapagos has licensed something that they say can do it in about 7 days, which would be conceivably a meaningful difference, both in terms of efficacy and safety, but also potentially cost and accessibility of CAR T. But that is in the early stages of development, and it would be some time before they would be competing there. So I feel sympathy for Paul Stoffels because I've listened to his appearances before Wall Street, and he's basically asked variations of what are you going to buy? And so when I had to sheepishly ask him, what are you going to buy? I felt stupid. He, of course, did not tell me specifically, but it's very much a wait and see story. And I think that resume that he built at J&J is such that he has afforded some patience from the market there. minus the negative $2 billion enterprise value.
And Damien, you mentioned the partnership that Galapagos formed with Gilead Sciences. Now, that's, again, one of the sort of first deals that Dan O'Day did. It has not gone well. I actually asked him about Galapagos at the Stat Science, the Breakthrough Summit that we had out in San Francisco. He seems to kind of still have confidence in, that deal may bear some fruit. And, he specifically pointed to Paul Stoffels as kind of the guy who could make it happen. What does Gilead still have as part of that deal? I mean, would they potentially benefit from anything that Paul does turn around at Galapagos?
They would, yeah. I mean, they have the rights to a bunch of drugs that are never going to get approved. So that's, setting that aside. But they still have basically right of first refusal on, I think it's 20 pipeline treatments from Galapagos. So they would have rights on the stuff that already exists from within Galapagos's labs. And so potentially, I mean, from Gilead's perspective, it was a $5 billion deal. It came to look like literally money set on fire pretty quickly. But those bad headlines have already passed. So it's really just like, it's all upside from here for Dan O'Day and for Gilead. So yeah, I mean, Gilead's capital is still in Galapagos's hands, and now it's in Paul's hands. And so, the same kind of optimism that a lot of people feel toward Galapagos's future by virtue of Paul being there, Gilead conceivably stands to benefit from that.
So, we're sort of bookending the week in advisory committee meetings. There was Sarepta's Duchenne muscular dystrophy gene therapy meeting on Friday, May 12th. That ended with a very close 8-6 vote in favor of the gene therapy. But it was a really kind of tense day with, a lot of discussions about whether the data were strong enough to support recommending approval of this gene therapy. Adam, what stuck out to you from the meeting?
I mean, what stuck out to me after listening to this meeting for 10 hours last Friday?
Yes.
It was a long day. I think you're right, Meg. It was tense. It was super interesting, back and forth. Like you said, the vote, kind of a narrow positive vote, 8-6. I actually, going into the final vote, I was actually texting with Brian Scorney, the analyst at Baird, and we were trying to sort of guess like who was voting which way, and I was down to 7-7. I really thought it was going to be a split vote, so 8-6, pretty close. What does that mean? I think that even though that's a narrow vote, a narrow positive vote, it is a positive vote. It is a recommendation of approval or accelerated approval for Sarepta's gene therapy. And I think that's enough for the FDA to grant accelerated approval to Sarepta's gene therapy, particularly because top officials at the FDA, notably Peter Marks, who runs the biologics division at the FDA, which is the division that oversees this review. He's very much on board with not only with the development of gene therapy, but the acceleration of gene therapy development and using the accelerated approval pathway to bring gene therapies to market. So I think he got what he needed from this panel to grant that accelerated approval. Now, whether it happens on May 29th, which is the deadline day for the approval decision, I think there's some speculation that it may be delayed by 3 months, mostly maybe to kind of settle up some lingering manufacturing issues that may have presented itself. I mean, that's purely speculation. We don't know. But it's a pretty tight window between that panel last Friday and that May 29th PDUFA date. So we'll see what happens.
Speaking of the manufacturing issues, one of the things that came up is that there was a different manufacturing process between some of the earlier trials and, the later ones and what will be the commercial product. But separately from that, there have been some headlines around Catalent, the contract manufacturer and a partner of Sarepta, having some manufacturing issues. And, the last I checked in with Sarepta on that when I was, still at CNBC, actually it was literally my last day. This was my last story at CNBC, was about this. Sarepta said that wasn't expected to affect anything for this DMD gene therapy. Have you heard anything about that, if that has changed or if that is still the case?
I haven't heard anything about that, but, again, if there is a delay, it sounds like that it would be a delay around manufacturing. So that's possible. And I think people are looking at, is there potential for maybe a 3-month delay? The other interesting sort of twist on that is this whole idea of, the confirmatory study that Sarepta is working on right now to confirm the benefit, right? We're talking here about an accelerated approval, so based on preliminary evidence. Sarepta has a confirmatory phase 3 study well underway. It's actually going to be finishing up towards the end of this year. During the panel on Friday, we learned that sort of the last patient visit for that study is going to be conducted in September, which means that, by the time the data could be analyzed, certainly kind of by December or maybe January of next year, it sets up this really fascinating kind of scenario here where, there is a risk to granting accelerated approval based on preliminary evidence, is because, at the end of the day, you're somewhat taking a guess as to whether or not this therapy is going to benefit patients. And so if the FDA does approve it, the next thing that we'll be looking at is that confirmatory study. And it's coming up really soon. If the confirmatory study is positive and we see a benefit, well then, right, it's off to the races. And this is going to be a gene therapy that I think a lot of patients are going to seek. A lot of the families of boys with Duchenne are going to seek for their sons. If it doesn't work, then what happens, right? Then we get into this whole tricky kind of mess about, well, is the FDA going to try to remove the gene therapy from the market? What do the data look like? And that will be a sort of another drama. Sarepta is a company, of course, which we know is sort of steeped in ups and downs and surprises and twists and turns. And, if that confirmatory study does not work, and obviously we don't know what the outcome of that study will be, but if it doesn't, then it'll be another chapter in kind of this sort of very volatile company. The biggest news this week dropped on Tuesday when the Federal Trade Commission filed a lawsuit seeking to block Amgen's $28 billion acquisition of Horizon Therapeutics.
So in that lawsuit, the FTC alleges that buying Horizon would allow Amgen to build monopolies around 2 of that company's approved drugs and keep other competing medicines from reaching patients.
More broadly, the FTC's actions signal tougher scrutiny of biopharma takeovers, even as the pace of deals starts to pick up. Joining us to discuss all of this is Jared Holz, the biotech strategist at Mizuho Securities. Jared, welcome back to the Readout Loud.
Thanks, Meg. Really appreciate it.
So, Jared, the basis of this lawsuit from the FTC centers around this idea of bundling. Can you kind of explain to our listeners what bundling is?
Yeah, Adam. Well, this is basically a strategy in which the pharmaceutical companies will sell drugs to consumers, to distributors, using a full menu of products as the entry point, hoping that if they buy certain drugs from the company, it will give them easier inroads into selling additional products through the same stream. So you can look at it in a similar fashion as what we see with medical devices and other companies within healthcare, where companies are trying to vie for market share position by offering multiple drugs through the same channel.
What was interesting about that being the sticking point, or many things were interesting about it, but one thing that struck me about that being the sticking point that the FTC took in trying to block this deal is that Amgen's previous bundling is the subject of a lawsuit from Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, its competitor in treatments for high cholesterol, such that Len Schliefer, the CEO of Regeneron, said publicly, I think it was at a Financial Times event, that he's glad the FTC is looking into this. He kind of broke ranks with his peers in the pharmaceutical industry of saying, actually, yeah, I think this is a reason to block that merger, which I thought was kind of fascinating.
I thought it was pretty interesting as well, although I don't think the bundling strategy that Amgen has used with PCSK9s, which is what Len was referring to, I believe, has really aided them too much. Amgen's strategy, I think, is essentially saying, we are selling, these 3 to 4 drugs, and if you're buying them from us, you may as well use us for this drug. Really see no major issue with that. It's a free market economy. Whether providers and doctors want to use an Amgen drug is basically their choice. Are they forcing the product to the market, kind of trying to supersede the efforts by Regeneron or others? I would say it's debatable at best. I think at the end of the day, doctors are using whichever drug they feel is better. Sometimes it comes down to availability. Sometimes it comes down to price. I feel like Amgen is probably using some sort of strategy to benefit themselves. But at the end of the day, the channel, physicians and other networks are the decision makers here. I really don't see a major issue with it, but yes, they're under scrutiny already.
So FTC argues the merger creates the potential for future harm. Is that too broad, Jared? Or hard to prove? How does the industry kind of look at what the FTC is doing?
Well, it seems like it's going to be pretty tough to prove. Looking at Amgen's strategy over the past several years, as well as other large cap pharma companies, most of the large cap names in this sector are trying to diversify. And the diversification strategy is in many cases is aimed at offering more drugs at more attractive prices. I feel like the FTC's scrutiny here is probably a little bit misaligned with what's actually happening in the industry. And honestly, I'm not really sure what their aim is here. Because once the Horizon drugs are under the Amgen umbrella, my perception of the deal was that the company was going to be run almost as a separate segment because of the lack of direct overlap between the two companies. Whether Amgen is going to, figure out ways to push the Horizon products in a more significant way. I think that's a similar strategy that's been employed at many other large companies inside or outside of healthcare. And maybe the way that we need to look at this is, this plays, pretty squarely into Lena Khan's whole notion of what's anti-competitive and what's not. Because if we go back to the Amazon structure, which is basically the backbone of the entire FTC's thesis around deal making, what's good for the consumer is not really what's important for the FTC if they see large companies getting stronger. But then we would really have to assess every deal that's happened in pharma over the past several years. This one really doesn't seem all that different from what we've seen Merck do, prior Pfizer deals, et cetera.
This idea of overlap, Jared, you mentioned, there isn't a lot of overlap between the products that Amgen sells and the products that Horizon sells. And when the deal was announced, people thought, well, from a competitive standpoint or an anti-competitive standpoint, there wouldn't be any objections to this deal. Yet here we are. And I wonder, if this bundling practice is something that the FTC is concerned about. I've seen some people say that, the FTC has avenues, other regulatory channels that it can investigate those practices without trying to block this deal. Do you kind of see it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. This transaction and the issues that the FTC has, at least on paper, has very little to do with overlap and more to do with the notion that a powerful company like Amgen is getting more powerful by adding 2, fairly significant drugs. Maybe you could argue just one, but a couple pretty significant drugs. And therefore, it increases their strength within the industry. And it increases the likelihood that these 2 drugs from Horizon are going to be bigger, therefore blocking out potential competition in the future. So to me, it's very little about market share, almost zero about market share, and almost all about theoretical market prowess when it comes down to what Amgen's going to look like over the next several years versus what it already looks like today.
So it's interesting, if this were to hold up in court, which I know there are a lot of doubts that it would, but just in a theoretical sense, we kind of understand that mergers are often challenged and potentially blocked when a company is consolidating power in like a single therapeutic area. Companies have to divest ostensibly competing drugs before acquiring companies that have newer medicines that compete in the same category. If this were to hold up, then it would also mean that deals could be blocked if companies were acquiring other firms that had not competing drugs whatsoever, but because of that diversification, they now have the potential to form monopolies, as you described. And you can kind of see the drug industry's point that sounds like they're backed into a corner where no one can buy anything ever again.
If this deal somehow gets blocked, and again, I agree with you, I think the odds are low, and I know other analysts have opined on this as well. If it were to be blocked, I think this is incredibly negative for pharma. It's really pretty negative for large cap companies in general. But I know that there was a lot of concern earlier this week on the headlines on Tuesday morning. When this came out, it was Monday night where the news was released, but Tuesday morning when the stocks were trading and everyone was up in arms about what it meant for biotech. I think it's far worse for pharma because on one hand, you've got the government cracking down on drug pricing vis-a-vis the IRA, which has been discussed a lot. And then on the other hand, they're preventing business consolidation. They're preventing pharma from building external pipelines in terms of going out and seeking what they think are good fits from a business development standpoint. So they're kind of hit both ways. I just don't understand, after everything that's happened with the pandemic and otherwise, why the government is still like what appears more and more like an adversarial view or relationship with pharma if they're disallowing them to, economically run their company or financially whatever. And then on the other hand, they cannot go out and buy companies. Seems like a double-edged sword to me. It would be precedent setting. But again, I think when we take a look at what it actually means for the industry, I think biotech can survive without M&A. I know investors obviously want there to be more deals, and it's a pillar of the investment thesis, but pharma kind of can't. That would be the worry if the likes of Amgen and Pfizer and Bristol, et cetera, are prevented from doing deals, and at the same time, some of their biggest products are going to see significant pricing degradation in the second half of the decade.
So you've said, it's unlikely that this actually gets blocked, but what is the impact of the lawsuit even just happening? Like, what impact will that have on biotech M&A moving forward? Even if it, doesn't work this time, does it signal that there is just going to be more pressure and more scrutiny? And could that really impact the way pharma looks at buying biotechs?
Yeah, I think all of the buyers are probably on notice across the board in terms of what this actually means. I think the bundling aspect of Amgen Horizon is, pretty tricky to understand in the context of what other companies are doing and exactly what their business practices are in selling multiple drugs to, multiple patient populations. This might be a case where large cap pharma business development teams just have to understand, what exactly the FTC is looking for here, their definition of bundling, what it means to push different medications through similar channels and kind of offer patients and providers, maybe a bigger menu, but maybe at discounted prices or better pricing that would lead to, market share gains, forcing other companies out. And it may be just the narrative changes in terms of the way that the companies talk about business development, what the integrations look like, what the cost cuttings look like. You might be able to get away with just as much M&A going forward, but the actual strategic design of the deals is going to be different, whereby potentially there's a little bit less cost cutting. You're running these divisions as unique pieces of the business rather than incorporating the drugs into, the same channel that you're selling other products.
So, Jared, you noted, or we all noted, that the news of this FTC action came out Monday night, and then stocks started trading on Tuesday. We're recording this podcast Thursday morning. So how have pharma and biotech stocks, overall reacted to what's happened?
Yeah, I mean, net biotech is, roughly flat on the week. It feels a lot worse, but XBI is hanging right around $85 as we speak. That's pretty much where it came into the week. There's obviously a little bit more concern. Does this alter the M&A landscape significantly? Some would argue yes, some would argue no. There was just a headline a day or so ago about argenx being looked at by pharmaceutical companies. I don't really think the pace of play has slowed down at all. I don't think business development teams are, shutting down or walking away from things they're looking at. So I think the fact that biotech is flat on the week probably makes sense. And pharma's been slightly weak. I would have thought it would be down more, actually. That's my concern going forward, is that the pharma stocks, in the DRG, large cap biotech, large cap pharma, if they're unable to do the deals that they wanted to or that they're aspiring to do, I think that puts much more pressure on the companies because, like we discussed earlier, we have drug pricing coming up. And one of the major ways to combat that is to diversify the portfolio. And early stage R&D is not enough. They have to kind of look at small and mid cap private and publicly traded companies to do that. If that shuts down or slows significantly, I think they're facing a lot of pressure, even more pressure than we think.
This is kind of a straight thought, but to your point about how the particulars of the Amgen Horizon deal are such that it seems like FTC could have challenged any number of previous transactions in the drug industry made by other drug makers that weren't Amgen. And Amgen, as we all know, has a reputation for, the joke is that they are a law firm with bioreactors. They are a litigious company, and an often quite successfully litigious company. And I wonder, do you think, Lina Khan and the FTC in general have been saying for some time now that they planned to apply extra scrutiny to the pharmaceutical industry? Do you think starting with Amgen is like, punching the biggest kid at the new school when you get there to set the tone?
It's possible. Part of this feels like an emotional reaction. Using bundling as a basis for blocking a deal, seems to be, not necessarily a weak argument, but a convoluted, complex argument when typically the FTC is looking at the world from a market share position. I'm not sure that Amgen's former actions are completely or in isolation the basis for what's going on here. There are a lot of other complexities to think about. And part of me feels like we have to look at the Pfizer Seagen deal and wonder whether the government was looking into that transaction, decided not to pursue something, and therefore moved over to Amgen Horizon just to kind of stake a claim that they were not going to allow all of these pharmaceutical mergers to happen without some level of intervention or scrutiny. And I think that's what we'll have to kind of wait and see over the next couple of months, if that's true, based on whether we hear of any major concern around the Pfizer deal, which is much larger.
Well, Jared, while we have you, we've often, had you on to discuss sort of the overall sentiment going on in biotech, looking more broadly. And of course, this topic affects sentiment. What are things like now as compared with how they might have looked earlier in the year?
I think sentiment in biotech is maybe slightly better than it was coming into the year. And the main reason I say that is because, we've spoken, for a couple years now around all of the risk factors and negative drivers impacting the space. Just seems like kind of like 2 years into the decline of this sector, that most of these negatives seem to be very well understood. The asset saturation, the funding environment, clinical trial success and failure rates, things of that nature, I think are very well understood by investors. And I pointed out earlier this week that these small and mid-cap biotech indices just seem to be making higher lows, meaning, we seem to be off the trough levels of performance with respect to the index as a whole. And I think that helps shift the mentality, at least less negative, maybe not holistically positive, but less negative. So maybe we're in a little bit of a, positive re-rating cycle. And it just seems like investors are more willing to stick things out here more so than over the past couple of years.
Jared, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
That does it for another episode of the Readout Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Bonato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and whether you think setting money on fire is a good investment strategy. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
See you next week.